Hello, everybody. My name is Dalton Nelson, and I thought I'd give a more in-depth explanation as to why I gave the game inFamous Second Son a 2 out of 10, because I got some feedback about why I gave it such a harsh score, and they wanted to know why I gave it that score. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First, my previous experience with the series, what I got out of playing Second Son, and then some more in-depth points about that. So I had played inFamous, the first one and the second one, at a friend's house, and I remember liking them both. And I didn't look at them really critically at the time. I just kind of played through them and enjoyed myself. And I remember them having this kind of gritty style to them while also feeling like you were that superhero that inFamous tries to let you to be. So, with that, I came into what I got out of Second Son was that it was extremely repetitive, that it was incompetently made, and that it was ultimately a waste of time, which I think is probably the worst video game that could exist, really. And so there are a couple of points that I can prove why I gave it such a harsh score. First of all, inFamous Second Son had a very repetitive gameplay. The gameplay, you would switch between these three powers usually as the player, and the three powers were neon. They were neon, video, and smoke, and they all acted the same way. There would be a three-hit combo neutral melee system. There would be projectiles that you could shoot. There was a running portion of your power. There was a heavy attack, a grenade, a slam, a hover, and then there was like a flashy finisher type move. And all the powers very much felt the same to me. Very airy, very sluggish, especially the smoke power, which the accompanying sound effects really didn't help its case. The only power I did like was the neon, because it did feel a little bit faster and had a little bit more weight to it. But I didn't feel like the way the game works is that you start with smoke, and then you get neon after that. And the problem is, because neon is so good, is that I didn't really feel like giving the video power a chance, which is what you get right after neon, or yeah, right after neon, because neon just felt so good that I just knew video, when they were putting me through the tutorial of the video power, it still felt the same as the smoke. So they didn't really give, for me anyway, they didn't really give the player the incentive to really play as any of the other powers, because the neon was marginally better than the other two powers, which felt very underwhelming and weak in comparison. So there was those three powers, and then there was a fourth power that they give you at the very end of the game, which was the concrete power, which ultimately felt pointless because it was the end of the game. And this game is a sandbox game, but I never really felt incentivized to visit this kind of empty world that they've created, so I never really felt like ever playing as concrete. Plus, I don't feel like the player would really play as concrete anyway, because of the fact that the game has a morality system, which I'll get more into later, where you can only be good or evil. And if you're going through your first playthrough, then you really wouldn't want to play as concrete. You would just start up a new game anyway, if you really enjoyed the game the first time, which I didn't. And so Second Son's sandboxedness is very much the definition of a sandbox to me. It was very bland and brown. It was full of loose pieces that really didn't make a whole, or really couldn't make a whole, until the player introduced some agency some third-party agency to make it fun. Something that wasn't really in the game, something that the player had to like put in their mind, or maybe self-impose a challenge onto using the game mechanics in an unintended way. So that sandboxedness really turned me off. And I don't hate sandbox games, but it's gotta feel interesting throughout. Like every little side thing that they put in the game has gotta feel interesting, which Second Son did not. For example, the spray paint mechanic felt very tacked on. It didn't really fit with the flow of this kind of beat 'em up game, which in itself kind of felt a little bit more medium paced than this very slower paced spray paint mechanic. And for those of you who haven't played it, what it is you go up to this point and you press a button and you tilt your controller a certain way, and then you have to use the DualShock 4's motion control plus a trigger to kind of spray paint a color onto the stencil. And once you apply 2 to 3 layers, you get this kind of picture. And then Daulton, which is what the player plays as, Daulton. We'll talk about more of him later. He just kind of sprays the rest of the picture for you, and then he'll just say some line, and it really felt out of place of this kind of superhero game. So the other side activities, away from the spray paint mechanic, generally boil down to looking into a specific area for this small thing, finding this thing using your phone, but you can only track it on the top of buildings, which was really weird and awful, because buildings, I don't know if people know this, but buildings have a very limited square area. So you'll have to jump down from a building, most often to ground level, which broke up the flow of those side activities. There was do this thing to a random pedestrian. Like if you were evil, you would kill like a sign flipper, which was almost hilarious. Like I don't know how that translates to evil, but whatever. But you would either kill like this pedestrian or you would heal them, like maybe they were just on the side coughing or something. And the last one would be destroy this, like the little drones that held the little shards or the little cameras. And everything was real little too. You had to like search for it in this huge empty Seattle themed sandbox thing. And because the environment wasn't really interesting, there was nothing really interesting about these look for this thing kind of side activities. So let's get into the story, because I thought the story was absolutely horrible, like in every aspect. For one, let's talk about the quote-unquote main character, who is Daulton Rowe. And Daulton Rowe is not a character. He doesn't really have anything that makes me feel like he was a real character. He just kind of felt like a blank slate that the player could then imprint themselves on. Especially his character design felt very bland and just kind of like, let's throw some denim on him because he's this rebel archetype. And he spray paints because he's a rebel and he finds some kind of enjoyment in spray painting. But even that point, that characteristic that they do give him, they kind of just abandon it throughout the rest of the game. The other thing about him is that he's a Comish, which is this kind of, I guess it's a Native American tribe that really feel connected with one another. And that also just kind of gets brushed aside. Like, it's a motivation to start the game, but throughout the actual meat of the story, that's never stays in a motivation. He just kind of like wants these powers to defeat the villain. So I think it's clear that the design team knew about this, because the UI design also kind of reflects how empty his character is, because the UI design is just spray paint. It's just spray painted little windows. Which is, again, as I went over, one of the two things that's really about this character. So the side characters also don't really serve a purpose. They don't do anything in the story. you just kind of meet them, absorb their power, and then you go through this kind of forced bonding session tutorial thing about the powers, and then you kind of forget about them until they're needed to turn up throughout the script. They never felt helpful or important, or really they needed to be there, a part of the story. The only side character that really I felt anything for was the character Fetch, which I think her real name is like Abigail Walker or something, who kind of had a neat-ish backstory, but also a backstory that's been done before. Speaking of backstories, they are really explained sloppily, either done through these kind of weird flashbacks where if Daulton is absorbing a character's powers, then the character kind of bleeds into this, like, I guess paint, which again, spray paint is the only part of Daulton that exists really, other than him being a Komish, but they kind of bleed into this paint, and then it's just this kind of very forced flashback about, oh, here's why I kind of turned evil, or here's why I was, what happened when I was a conduit. So it's either that or it's spoken out loud, like these inner monologues that are supposed to be in the character's head and very much sound like they're supposed to be in the character's heads. They're more spoken out loud, so that feels very forced and lazy. Nobody talks like a real person either. They say really cliched lines, some lines that really stuck out to me as being really unoriginal were, who's the real monster here? I'm saving the world. I hope nothing bigger comes to attack us. Like, these are all lines that have been written before and are just, they make me groan as a player more than engage me. Like, they really didn't write anything substantial for this game, did they? They just kind of like tacked on this story mode that really didn't need to be there. Going back to Daulton, his little spongy power thing where he absorbs power from other people is never really explained, and I would have really liked it to be, because he is clearly special in this universe. No other character can really do this. And when he meets the main antagonist of the game, even she remarks about his power, but the game ultimately ignores this. They never really give an explanation as to why he can absorb powers, or when he is absorbing powers, why he can look into the backstory of these characters. They never say why. He just kind of, it just happens. The game's moral is also really simple, where, like, it's just, like, you've kind of heard this before in other pieces of media where, like, inequality, racism, bigotry, it's bad. I mean, we know it's bad. What about this is bad? Can you put your own nuanced spin on this with the conduits? Because you didn't in this game. You just kind of said, hey, it's bad to kind of separate each other for this one thing, one different thing. Because that's obviously not how humanity works. Especially if you're listening to this in the... I'm sorry, my mic is acting up here. So, yeah, especially in this kind of like Trump era of discourse here in America, we kind of know that this kind of simple message just doesn't work on people. So I wish they brought a little bit more complexity onto that. Going back to characters, I did mention before that characters just kind of fell into an archetype. There was like the druggie, the nerd, the rebel, the good moral person, the evil person. There was a guardian. Nobody felt like complex. They just kind of felt like they fit into a mold. So it was pretty easy to see why they chose to make a game about Fetch instead of keep this game in people's minds. This game, inFamous First Light, came 5 months after Second Son's release, so it was pretty quick. And it's easy to see why they chose Fetch specifically, because she's the most interesting character in the game, and plus she has the neon power, which I went over is the most fun power in the game. So I want to transition over into sound, which I don't have much to really say about it, but there's only 2 points I had about it, which was the soundtrack was so how would I subscribe it? Just kind of like in the background. It was so far in the background that it might as well not have been there. There was nothing to really say about it. They didn't really try with the soundtrack. It's just kind of like just noises. And then there's Troy Baker, who plays Delson, who, because Delson doesn't have any character about him, Troy Baker just kind of plays Troy Baker in this game. He doesn't have any character traits to really portray it within his acting. So he kind of sounds like every other role he's kind of filled within the video games industry. He doesn't give Delson any kind of nuance or anything. So let's go into my final points, where the game itself, where I felt that nothing felt creative, everything just kind of felt there. Nothing popped out, nothing stayed within my mind. There was nothing I mean, obviously right now there are things that I can talk about, but that's because I'm freshly off the game, but I can easily see myself kind of forgetting a lot of what happened in inFamous over the coming weeks, just because it was just so lukewarm in its delivery. Delson has this kind of parkour thing about him, or I really just call it climbing, where it's got this thing where it's either way too sticky or it doesn't work when you want it to. For example, in the very beginning of the game, I was just kind of jumping around and I didn't want to stick to buildings, but the model would always, or Delson's model would always go towards the nearest building ledge, which I didn't want to happen. Or at the end of the game, where you're fighting what's her name, Augustine, and you try to climb up these things, and he just wouldn't attach himself to the ledge. The game would often dip in frame rate or quality. There were often times, especially when particle effects entered the mix, the game would take a huge dip in frame rate then. The game would also you could clip through walls at times. Sometimes your character would just sink into the floor while you're fighting somebody. And transitioning from fighting, it seemed that the enemy and player's health work the same, in which it relies on successive hits, not total hits. And what this means is that if you don't land all of your hits within a combo, you might as well not have hit this guy at all. You might as well just try again. And so that really frustrated me, especially when the same fight with the same goon happened several times throughout the game, and it just played out the exact same way with the same 1, 2, 3 hit neutral combo that you would always just approach the enemy with. The player's damage, specifically, they did not handle very well, as when the player took damage, the screen would desaturize, and it would be overlaid with this kind of black vignette, which again is in this kind of spray paint style, going back to the only thing about Delson. But it made the game harder to see, which was jarring, because I would think as a game developer I would want the players to see when their health is low, so they could either escape or see what is hitting them. But rather, what they did here inhibits the player and just kind of makes things a lot worse. And it's not really clear how many hits you can take before you are dead. And the developers knew this wasn't clear, because at the very beginning of the game, when they're going through the tutorials, they had to tell the players they were taking damage, which is just really jarring. Like, if you have to tell your player that they are taking damage, you should know that you've done something wrong. I already went through the kind of structural problems with frame rates and ground clipping. Something that I didn't consider that I saw Yahtzee Croshaw kind of talk about in his review was the morality system. You can only pick between two extremes, good or evil. There's no real middle ground. So you could only do like an evil or a good playthrough. So why would the game really give us a choice throughout? Why not just choose whether this is going to be your evil playthrough or your good playthrough? Why not make endings for like the middle grounds where you're just kind of evil or kind of good? And these kind of two extremes just kind of felt like a crutch for leveling up and gaining more abilities, because some abilities would be locked away until you achieved like level 5 evil, and then you would get like, say, endless running or something. And so it just kind of felt like forced progression. And what you could unlock felt really small. I just ended up using the default moves. There was nothing really motivating me to try these, quote, new cool moves, because they didn't feel new or cool. They just kind of felt like tacked on. And there's going to be a dog barking in the background. I'm sorry. Another thing that I didn't like about the game was the lighting, which was very horrible. The lighting made it so that direct sources would always kind of blind you, like sunsets would really blind the environment. And at night this became a lot worse, as environments would get darker with the more light that was introduced. And so when they introduced the neon power would be at the very center of the screen, and it would totally blacken the rest of the screen, and would make the environment much darker. It would be much harder to play, and I had a real problem with that kind of lighting system. I didn't really feel like the lighting was as revolutionary as some of the other reviews kind of pointed out that it was. The last kind of point I have about the game was that enemies in the distance felt like they had the upper hand. Odds were that if I wasn't on the same plane as them, I wasn't really going to hit them with any kind of projectile. But they could sure as hell hit me. They fucking hit me dead on. So it just felt very unfair, and that the game encouraged more close counter fighting instead, which again kind of felt like the same encounter every time you ran into a goon. So my conclusion is that inFamous Second Son is the worst kind of game. It's boring, it's uncreative, it's not memorable in the slightest. There are many games that do the things in that Second Son does better. So I'm going to give this I gave this a 2 out of 10 on Instagram, and I think it deserves that score. I don't really think that's harsh, just because this game is so boring and inconsequential. I wouldn't recommend this to anybody. I just would I'm glad that this was free on PSN, because I would definitely not pay money for this. So that kind of concludes my in-depth thoughts on inFamous Second Son, and hopefully that sheds some light onto why I chose the review that I did, and why I felt that this was kind of just a bad game.